Leaders from around the world gathered in Laos last week for the annual ASEAN summit. We will discuss the importance of Southeast Asia for the global economy. Hello, I'm Ahmed, and this is The Heat. The leaders of Southeast Asian countries are fresh off their annual meeting held this year in Laos. Among areas of focus, they agreed to upgrade a free trade agreement with China. China's Premier Li Qiang was there to represent Beijing. Ryan Meltzer has our report.
Bringing together the ASEAN countries, China, the EU, US, Russia and others, the East Asia Summit is an unlikely grouping. And its goals might seem unlikely too, given the current climate with the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, and closer to home, Myanmar.
It is crucial that we strengthen cooperation under the East Asia framework to foster mutual understanding, mutual trust and mutual confidence as key elements to our shared objectives of peace, stability and sustainable development.
On the sidelines of the main gatherings, Chinese Premier Li Qiang held a number of bilateral meetings. After holding talks with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Li met Thursday night with Japanese PM Shigeru Ishiba, with the two striking a conciliatory tone.
We hope that both sides can work together to meet each other halfway, continuously consolidate political rejuvenation, strengthen dialogue and cooperation.
Friday morning, Li held talks with the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, amid a worsening trade row, with the EU imposing high tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles and China retaliating.
China is willing to continue to work with EU leaders to further consolidate the stable and positive momentum of China-EU relations, enhancing strategic mutual trust and strengthening mutually beneficial cooperation.
The European Council President warned of the dispute escalating into a full-blown trade war.
I still hope that it will be possible in the days to come, in the weeks to come, to make an agreement, to find some solutions.
This ASEAN summit may not have seen any giant breakthroughs, but it did provide opportunities for countries with serious differences to hold meetings on the sidelines, keeping lines of communication open and at least helping prevent conflicts and disputes from worsening. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Vientiane.
To continue our discussion, let's bring in our panel. From Kuala Lumpur, Ihsan O is Principal Advisor at Pacific Research Center in Malaysia. From Xi'an, Zoon Ahmed Khan is a Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives. And Sourabh Gupta is Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. He joins us from Maryland. Welcome to all of you. Zoon, let me start with you. As I said, this ASEAN summit ended last week. The 10 member states of ASEAN were there. They were joined by leaders from other countries as well. There were leaders from, of course, China, from the European Union, from India, as well as from the United States. There were also leaders from Australia at this meeting. What were your main takeaways from this ASEAN summit?
I think firstly, Anand, that, given the geopolitical context and given how, especially, COVID-19 and the talk of a new Cold War has been gripping not only the world at large, but ASEAN in particular as a region, as a possible spoiler for the kind of pragmatic consensus that ASEAN has been able to manage and move forward as a result of. I think the ASEAN summit is basically, proving that if you as a region develop this kind of understanding, develop goals, for example, enhancing connectivity and resilience was the major theme of the summit in Laos, then the world at large and otherwise countries and regions that might have disagreed will see you as an opportunity. And I think ASEAN really exhibits that even though we have challenges, there are disagreements in major, aspects, especially when it comes to major powers. Given ASEAN's own very committed, perspective on how they want to cooperate together, even countries that otherwise may disagree are coming and moving forward with wanting to cooperate further with ASEAN. So I think this is a very positive message. It gives a very strong signal that we are not in the world where we were maybe in the immediate beginning of the previous Cold War. We are in a world where regions have the capacity to set the tone for themselves. And at the same time, of course, ASEAN and China have similar common goals. This was also the 27th China-ASEAN meeting. We see that now the 3.0 FTA is also in place, where the pragmatic goals that the countries together decide. For example, they want a green economy. They want help with technical cooperation. They see China as an opportunity. And that is creating limited space for the kind of conversations that some countries had in mind. For instance, creating an Asian NATO. And there is limited and actually almost zero scope for this kind of conversation in ASEAN. So the ASEAN leadership setting that tone and making it clear that they want to cooperate, they want to continue moving forward in an economic and pragmatic sense. And the challenges the region faces are ones that the region can address on their own. And a good example of this is also the COC between China and ASEAN, countries where they are thinking of, how to address the South China Sea challenges. Lastly, I will say that for Belt and Road countries, all ASEAN members are participants in the Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, there are some challenges at times on bilateral levels that the ASEAN countries may have with China, but that does not stop them from growing together, collaborating together, becoming each other's largest trading partners, and remaining committed to a common vision. This is an excellent example also, not only for other countries that are trying to spoil that atmosphere in the ASEAN region. It is also an example for other Belt and Road regions that with this kind of perspective, with regional consensus, the dividends on development investment can be much broader. So ASEAN stands resilient. I think this is the biggest, most important takeaway from the summit in Laos.
Okay, Einar, Tangen, let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between China and ASEAN. Trade between China and the group has grown more than 15-fold in the past 20 years. It now amounts to $911.7 billion. That's close to $1 trillion. China has been ASEAN's biggest trading partner for more than a decade. And what does this tell you about the relationship between China and this bloc?
Well, it's been very positive. You look at the South China, ASEAN, and what you have is one of the few bright economic spots out there. Now, obviously, a lot of this growth, it was 4.4% growth in terms of trade relations in August. It's almost been 20% last year. This is partly due to the fact that, this kind of de-risking thing that's going around. You have countries, Philippines, throughout Indonesia, et cetera, that are benefiting from the fact that a lot of Chinese companies are looking elsewhere, downstreaming, trying to deal with this de-risking which the U.S. is pushing. So very important to the region. But, I would agree with Zoon. This is a triumph of regionalism over the inability of international relations, especially at the UN, to solve issues. Here you saw a very, very humble approach. There was something for everybody, whether you're Korea, South Korea, Japan, U.S., etc., and China, of course, having that trade agreement, very, very important. So I think when you start looking at the future and you see the kind of difficulties that you're having with the traditional institutions post World War II, this is very positive.
Right, and Einar, one other development, China and ASEAN also announced the conclusion of version 3.0 of the free trade area upgrade negotiations. What can you tell us about that?
Very important. This is one of China's goals, was to upgrade this so that they can go forward. This is reducing tariffs more. This benefits both sides. This is that kind of win-win situation, which benefits everybody. Cheaper goods coming from China, less tariffs, etc., are then passed on to consumers, giving them more money in their pocket for the same quality that they wanted before. A very, very stark contrast to the United States, where they, Donald Trump believes that tariffs are somehow a good thing.
Sourabh Gupta, as we mentioned, the ASEAN meeting was attended by leaders from all over the world. How important are these ASEAN member states for the global economy?
Oh, I think they're very important for the global economy. As Einar just said, Asia and ASEAN is one of the rare bright spots in the global economy, and therefore, as we're also noticing in this age of trade war and de-risking, etc., ASEAN is become an important manufacturing platform for many countries also, including for China. And that's why in terms for China, it's not just trading with ASEAN, that relationship is changing a little bit where China is becoming an important investor in ASEAN countries and thereafter the producing for third markets. What I would say about the meeting is that it is a reflection of what ASEAN does very well. Three things. It provides a platform, which is a very broad platform, where a lot of parties can speak, even those who are at odds with each other. We've seen the Indians and the Canadians having a conversation out there. We've seen the EU chief, the EU president and Li Jiang having the conversation out there. We're seeing the Japanese and Chinese premiers having a conversation out there. So a very broad platform. Secondly, it discusses all the issues under the sun which relate to the Asia-Pacific region and touch upon ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And they were all touched upon in a very wide-ranging context. And finally, the third point, through these meetings, implicitly and explicitly, ASEAN manages to make its centrality heard and felt. And countries might want to go around ASEAN and hope to do so, but they know at the end of the day, they have to work through ASEAN if they want to get their agenda moving in this part of the world. And I think ASEAN does that very quietly, gently, but very firmly. And we saw it again at this summit meetings.
Right, and so getting back to what Zoon was talking about earlier on, the sort of philosophical underpinnings of how this organization operates, how members interact with each other, and how the organization as a whole interacts with the rest of the world. It's not something that looks for competition, a kind of zero-sum game where there have to be winners and losers. And in that sense, is it fair to say that it emulates very much the Chinese philosophy of win-win?
It does from that perspective, the philosophy of win-win. It creates a very broad tent approach, looks for people to have come in with just prudent, pragmatic solutions to matters. It is not judgmental on particular issues, including difficult issues within ASEAN, like on Myanmar. There's patience exhibited in trying to get to solutions because one cannot force solutions down people's throats. And so from that perspective, I think ASEAN is a very valuable entity to have in the Indo-Pacific and in the global order at a time when there are a lot of parties trying to divide the world into us versus them. ASEAN is this huge block, this huge chunk right in the middle saying we will not be divided, and you are willy-nilly have to go through us, and you have to respect our centrality. And I think it sets a very good tone and a good example for others too.
Einar, great to see you again. There have been some comparisons made between ASEAN and the European Union, but analysts point out, look, the EU is very different from ASEAN. ASEAN, for example, is a very diverse group made up of different political structures, different religions, different languages. Do you think that this kind of diversity, these differences may be obstacles to progress, to reaching their goals, to growth, or do you think these nations are able to embrace this diversity?
Well, ASEAN, it's a very loose binding international regional organization. It respects the respective sovereignty of its member states tremendously. On the other hand, where there are some consensus, especially on socio-economic matters, ASEAN countries would come together. All these ASEAN economic community, ASEAN's FTAs with China and with other economic powers would be testaments to that. I think this sort of loose binding type of structure actually would exude ASEAN's resilience when it comes to, for example, nowadays there's a lot of conflicts and confrontations around the world, while ASEAN itself still remains relatively, or I would say very peaceful, and indeed one of the most prosperous regions around the world with very high economic growth rates and so on. Of course, there are challenges to ASEAN's centralities because different powers around the world, they would of course try to build their own spheres of influence and so on. But ASEAN, throughout this sort of very murky waters, it navigates itself relatively well. And I think this sort of resilience would be sustainable in the future.
Yeah, Nisano, if we look at how ASEAN has grown, how it has matured over the years, I mean, we take some of the member states of ASEAN, they've had tensions in the past. We look at, for instance, Vietnam and Cambodia. There's also Indonesia, which actually is supporting Timor-Leste's bid for membership in ASEAN. But despite these sort of historical differences, they've now put that aside and they've come together. I mean, is this a testament to show that the group can put things aside? They can put their past behind them to move?
Well, indeed, this is a very pragmatic region of the world, situating itself at the crossroads of East and West, major shipping routes passing through the region. And of course, doing business and doing business well has always been the mainstay of Southeast Asian countries and by extension, ASEAN's, well, I would say it's actually one main pillar of its centrality, not only in terms of the security sense, but also in terms of the economic sense. And thereby, of course, these countries with different ideologies, cultures, languages, religions, and so on. I think it's even more diverse if you talk about all these religions and culture and so on than, let's say, the Middle East and so on. And yet we could come together in a very peaceful manner and indeed try to help each other to develop. And as mentioned before, we try to sort of usher in this sort of win-win situation among ourselves and with our major trading partners.
Zoon, one idea that was very quickly rejected came from the Japanese Prime Minister, was talking about the formation of some kind of NATO-type organization in Southeast Asia. As I said, that was rejected, dismissed by all countries very quickly. What do you make of that? I mean, is that firmly a rejection of what NATO does? I mean, we've seen what NATO does. I mean, it uses violence as a first option in many instances to resolve problems and to achieve its goals.
I think, I mean, this has been a very important development, because that absolute rejection of this idea of an Asian NATO in ASEAN, a region which, again, as all of the panelists have also mentioned, is the epitome of pragmatism and the kind of dividends that perspective pays off a region. Let's also not forget that SEATO was a reality, an American attempt back right after, in the beginning of the Cold War, to create a kind of military alliance in this region, and that failed. Interestingly, Pakistan, because it was East Pakistan at that time, was also a member of this organization. That failed. ASEAN becomes, again, a very pragmatic, economically focused region, and this is something that has remained a consistency. Additionally, what we see, one of the things we were discussing during COVID-19 was, either the world will become more paranoid, regions will become, likely to choose one side or the other, see in black and white, become more geopolitical, or they might become more pragmatic because they realize that this is the only way forward, this is the requirement. I think ASEAN has clearly made the latter choice. Also, we realize that NATO not only has a terrible reputation, look at West of Asia, for example. It is unfortunately the opposite of what East Asia has become, because of not only, a lack of consensus and limited connectivity, but also interventions. And again, the crisis in Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine crisis, that is not a good example. So I think ASEAN, this experience in the last 2-3 years, we have seen wars in Europe, in the Middle East, ASEAN realizes that this concept is obviously anyway did not resonate. It didn't work in the past. And at the same time, there is absolutely no space to securitize and to create this kind of alliance. So I think that's a very positive and strong message.
Einar Tangen, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he was at this summit in Laos. He spoke about the situation in Ukraine, about freedom of navigation in Asia as well. But China Daily newspaper wrote an article saying that ASEAN should beware, actually, of the U.S. hijacking its agenda, and said that the U.S. role, I'm quoting here, the U.S. sole interest in ASEAN is to drive a wedge between the group and China. What do you make of that?
Well, it's true. I mean, it's no big secret that the United States wants to contain China militarily, politically, and economically. That's not the issue. The issue is really going back to, where were we post-World War II? The mindset of the United States, sometimes followed by Europe, was that any difference is a challenge and has to be met asymmetrically. We saw what happened in Vietnam, etc. And now what you have is a multipolar world coming forward, and they're saying, listen, differences, everybody has them. The issue is I don't try to force my differences on you. What we can do is understand and accept our differences and go forward. This is a far better way of handling the world than this insistence that I'm right and you have to follow me.
Yeah.
So when you have somebody like Blinken who's coming into this, they are pushing this old agenda that a challenge from China, even, it doesn't matter who they were, 30 years ago it was Japan that needed to be knocked down. And in future, if that attitude continues, it'll be applied towards others. And I think ASEAN sees this and they would like to avoid it.
Sourabh, there was an opinion piece in the South China Morning Post which says that U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia should be strengthened as key to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and that no matter who wins the U.S. election a month from now, well, less than a month, 3 weeks from now, the U.S. will keep in focus ASEAN countries. In fact, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that, he said almost the same thing. He said, the basic approach will continue irrespective of who's president because it is so manifestly in our interest. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's what the U.S. government says and wants folks in that region to believe. But the fact of the matter is that the folks in the region have been asking the United States for far deeper, greater economic engagement and have not seen that. I mean, in terms of development financing, in terms of market access, the U.S. is either at a standstill or it's moving backwards. For countries in Southeast Asia, for unaligned, non-aligned countries in Asia, the goal is to have as good an economic relationship with both China and the United States. And for some who are bordering China, they hope to have also the U.S. be a security guarantor or a provider of security public goods. The U.S. is happy to provide those public goods and be security guarantors, but that's just half the story. It's perhaps 1/3 of the story. It needs deeper engagement economically, and that has been clearly lacking. It's been lacking now for a couple of years, and we don't even have many of these folks even showing up out there in Southeast Asia at these important summits. I mean, Blinken is out there. The president is not traveling.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I think that where the United States is not doing right is bodies like ASEAN, bodies like regional organizations. These organizations, they are premised on cooperation to broaden the space, premised on trying to broaden the space of positive engagement and cooperation. It should not, they want to be a building block for cooperation. The United States is not necessarily looking at the region in terms of building blocks. It's looking at small entities or groups and little cliques to become building blocks in how it manages the geopolitics of the region.
Right.
And therefore, I think the U.S. is not on the right track in terms of with regard to what you asked.
Isano, the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, he's been very critical towards Western nations in recent months. Anwar accused European governments of hypocrisy, and in a recent interview, I'm quoting him here, he lashed out. He said he lashed out at the sheer hypocrisy of many countries in the West to condone what is happening in Gaza, describing the stance that these countries are taking as shocking and appalling. Do you see ASEAN have any kind of common political view on crises like the ones we are seeing now?
Well, again, ASEAN does not have a common foreign policy, as does the European Union, where there are consensus on certain foreign policy issue. There will be statements issued typically after summits such as the one recently held in Laos. Well, different countries, they have different views on what's going on around the world. And if there are no such consensus, then you wouldn't see languages other than, looking forward to more peace and stability in a particular region of the world and so forth. In Malaysia's case, because it's a Muslim majority country, of course, it has well, at least the government has some concerns over what's going on in Gaza, in the Middle East, and so forth. Whether other ASEAN countries would have a similar view, I think that remains to be seen.
Einar, very quickly, I've got less than a minute. There was a survey done in April by the Esaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore that revealed that more Southeast Asian nations favored alignment with China than with the United States. And that opinion, that shift, was largely attributed to what is going on in Gaza right now and Washington's failure to broker any kind of ceasefire. Is it fair to say then that the United States is losing influence in the region?
Well, it's not just the region. You can look across the world. The votes in the UN clearly show that there's a tremendous amount of frustration with the fact that the U.S. keeps talking about human rights, values, and all of these things, yet supports what is in essence a genocide going on in Gaza, and now an expanded war. And you hear this tut-tut, but the bombs and the bullets continue to arrive and continue to be used against people.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.